It's interesting to talk about the process of writing. You mentioned you were in New York. What have you learned from writing these two books about the actual process of writing? And maybe, I don't know what's the most interesting thing to talk about there, maybe the biggest challenges or the boring, mundane, systematic, like day to day of what worked for you, like hacks, or even just about the neuroscience that you've learned through the process of trying to write them.
Here's the thing I learned. If you think that it's going to take you a year to write your book, it's going to take you 3 years to write your book. That's the
Yeah.
first thing I learned, is that you, no matter how organized you are, it's always going to take way longer than what you think. In part because um, very few people make an outline and then just stick to it. You know, the some of the topics really take on a life of their own, and to some extent, you want to let them have their voice. You know, you want to follow leads until you feel satisfied that you've dealt with the topic um, appropriately. But and that part is actually fun. It's not fun to feel like you're constantly behind the 8 ball in terms of time.
Yeah.
But it is, the exploration and the foraging for information is incredibly fun. For me, anyways, I found it really enjoyable. And if I wasn't also running a lab at the same time and trying to keep my family going, it would have been, the whole thing would have just been fun. But I would say the most important thing I think I learned is also the hardest thing, and for me, which is knowing what to leave out. A really good storyteller knows what to leave out. In academic writing, you shouldn't leave anything out. You all the details should be there.
Right.
And I've written or participated in writing over 200 papers, peer-reviewed papers. So I'm pretty good with detail. Knowing what to leave out and not harming the validity of the story. That is a tricky, tricky thing. It was tricky when I wrote How Emotions Are Made, but that's a standard popular science book. So it's 300 something pages. And then, it has like 1,000 endnotes. And then each of the endnotes is attached to a web note, which is also long.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's, the final draft, I wrote 3 drafts of that book actually, and the final draft, and then I had to cut by a third. It was like 150,000 words or something, and I had to cut it down to like 110. So, obviously I struggle with what to leave out. Brevity is not my strong suit. I'm always telling people that. It's a warning. So that's why this book was I'd always been really fascinated with essays. I love reading essays. And after reading a small set of essays by Anne Fadiman called At Large and at Small, which I just loved, these little essays.
What's the topic of those essays?
They're called familiar essays. So the topics are like everyday topics, like mail, coffee, chocolate. And what she does is she weaves her own experience. It's a little bit like these conversations that you're so good at curating, actually. You're weaving together history and philosophy and science and also personal reflections.
Mm-hmm.
And a little bit you feel like you're like eavesdropping on someone's train of thought in a way. Mm. They're really compelling to me. And
even if it's just like a mundane topic.
Yeah, but it's so interesting to learn about like all of these little stories in the wrapping of the history of like mail.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's really interesting. And so I read these essays, and then I wrote to her a little fangirl email. This was many years ago, and I said I just loved I loved this book, and how did you learn to write essays like this? And she gave me a reading list of essays that I should read, like writers, and so I read them all. And anyway, so I decided it would be a really good challenge for me to try to write something really brief where I could focus on one or two really fascinating tidbits of neuroscience, connect each one to something philosophical or like just a question about human nature.
Mm-hmm.
Do it in a really brief format without violating the validity of the science. That was I just set myself what I thought of as a really, really big challenge, in part because it was an incredibly hard thing for me to do in the first book.
Yeah, we should say that this is the 7.5 Lessons is a very short book. I mean, it's like it embodies brevity, right? The whole point throughout is just, I mean, you could tell that there's editing, like there's pain in trying to bring it as brief as possible, as clean as possible. Yeah.
Yeah. So the way I think of it is, it's a little book of big science and big ideas.
Yeah. Really big ideas in brief little packages.
And, I wrote it so that people could read it. I love reading on the beach. I love
Yeah.
reading essays on the beach. I wrote it so people could read it on the beach or in the bathtub or, a subway stop.
Yeah. Even if the beach is frozen over in the snow.
Yeah. So my husband, Dan, calls it the first neuroscience beach read. That's his that's his phrasing. Yeah.
And like you said, you learn a lot about writing from your husband, like you were saying offline.
Well, he is of the two of us, he is the better writer. He is a masterful writer. He's also, I mean, he's a PhD in computer science. He's a software engineer, but he's also really good at organization of knowledge. So he built, for a company he used to work for, he built one of the first knowledge management systems, and he now works at Google where he does engineering education. Like he understands how to tell a good story, just about anything really. He's got impeccable timing. He's really funny, and luckily for me, he knows very little about psychology or neuroscience. Right. Well, now he knows more, obviously, but so he was really, when How Emotions Were Made, he was really, really helpful to me because the first draft of every chapter was me talking to him about I would talk out loud about what I wanted to say and the order in which I wanted to say it. And then I would write it. And then he would read it and tell me all the bits that could be excised.
Yeah.
And sometimes we would, I should say, I mean, he and I don't really argue about much except directions in the car. Like right. If we're going to have an argument, that's going to be where it's going to happen.
What's the nature of the argument about directions exactly?
I don't really know. It's just that I think it's that spatially, I use egocentric space. So I want to say, turn left. Like I'm reasoning in relation to like my own physical corporeal body. Mm-hmm. So, you walk to the church and you turn left, right. And then whatever, I'm always like, and he gives directions allocentrically, which means organized around north, south, east, west. Right.
So to you, the Earth is at the center of the solar system, and to him,
no, I'm at
reasonably,
the center. I'm at the center.
You're at the center of the solar system. Okay, so
anyway, so we but here we had some really rip-roaring arguments, where he would say, like, who is this for? Is this for the 1%? Yeah. And I'd be like, 1% meaning not wealth, but like civilians versus academics. So are these for the scientists or for is this for the civilians, right?
So he speaks for the people, for the civilians.
He speaks for the people, and I'd be like, no, you have to. And so he made after one terrible argument that we had where it was really starting to affect our relationship because we were so mad at each other all the time, he made these little signs, writing and science. And we only used them. This was like when you pulled out a sign, that's it. Like the other person just wins and you have to stop fighting about it.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Great.
And so we just did that. Yeah. And we didn't really have to use it too much for this book because this book was in some ways, I didn't have to learn a lot of new things for this book. I had to learn some, but I a lot of what I learned for how emotions are made really stood me in good stead for this book. So there was a little bit. Each essay was a little bit of learning. A couple was a little more than a small amount, but I didn't have so much trouble here. I had a lot of trouble with the first book, but still, even here, he would tell me that I could take something out, and I really wanted to keep it, and um, I think we only used the signs once.